Good afternoon, everybody. I see people actually pouring in now, so I will begin. My name is Marc Lamont Hill. It's good to see it's good to see everybody today. We are here for the fourth installment in a 5-week series here in July, sponsored by CUESEF, or by the Center for Urban Education, rather. And it's the Center for Urban Education Summer Education Forum, where we have been talking and thinking really deeply about this idea of crisis pedagogies, thinking really carefully with a group of people, multiple groups of people, about these questions around community, around the common good, around the public, trying to figure out how, in moments of crisis, we can locate solutions, we can deepen our analysis, we can engage in forms of practice, we can participate in forms of resistance that will leave the public good expanded, that will leave our communities stronger, and that will prepare us to dismantle unjust forms of power and to expand human possibility and freedom. And I couldn't be prouder of the work that's happened. In the previous 3 weeks, we have been talking to students, we've been talking to community leaders, as we did last week. Week before that, we spoke to caregivers, parents. We have had the opportunity in so many ways to think deeply about these issues with a wide range of people. And this week is no different. We are having a wonderful conversation this afternoon with educators, with teachers, with people in both formal and informal spaces who are engaged in forms of teaching and learning that our students depend upon. And one of the things we've had to wrestle with in the last 4 months is, how do we do school? How do we teach? How do we elevate the educational, expand the educational possibilities of our young people, of our students, against the backdrop of crisis? How do you educate in a moment of COVID? How do you teach in a time of unabashed state violence? How do you help students prepare not just to pass a state test, but, as Dewey imagined, to be participants in democratic society, to be at a moment where the very notion of citizenship, the very notion of civic engagement, the very notion of belonging is so up for grabs. It's so contested, and it's so starkly opposed to the lives, experiences, and even the bodies of the most vulnerable people in this country. And so these are questions we're trying to wrestle with. We're trying to figure this stuff out. And so who better to bring in to the conversation than this amazing group of educators? I'm going to introduce them now, and then we're going to get this conversation going. And as always, those of you who are here, and I see 155 people in the room right now, that's amazing. We'll have an opportunity for you all to jump into the conversation as well, to ask questions, to engage, to push back. But I want to make sure we have a robust conversation to set the table for that kind of conversation as well. I'm so grateful to have you all in the room. I'm joined by, excuse me, I'm be coughing. This coronavirus is still in me, but I'm fighting a good fight. We managed to do it last week, so we're gonna do it again this week with the help of some water and some patience that y'all hopefully will have for me. So please indulge me. Amil Nieri Thomas Cook is a passionate African-American male urban educator who has been devoted to serving his community for nearly 15 years. Throughout his professional career, Cook has served in educational capacities from clinical supervisor for adjudicated youth to a classroom teacher. Cook challenges his students to embrace their personal narratives, dive deep into their historical narratives, and incorporate cutting-edge technology and media skills as they navigate into the future. Cook currently serves as a computer science and graphic design teacher at Propel Andrew Street High School, while also coordinating the school's after-school program. Cook is a founding member and lead technologist of the international community of hip-hop educators, better known as Hip Hop Ed. He authored Computer-Based Technology for Special and Multicultural Education, Enhancing 21st Century Learning. Let's show some love for Amil.
Peace, what up? Thank you for that introduction.
Absolutely, absolutely. Let me add to the conversation Janet Niethamer, who is a strong and enthusiastic educator with a vast teaching competency procured over the last 25 years. She has taught high school, kindergarten, first grade, and was an elementary school librarian, all while studying and advocating for social justice and equity within her community and school district, one of the most diverse ones in Allegheny County. Niethamer has completed research on the acquisition and use of multicultural children's literature in community libraries, and more recently participated in professional practitioner groups such as Educators for Equity, Love, and Justice, and the Empowered Educators series. She also co-presented Pathways to Culturally Responsive Teaching at last year's CUESEF. Currently, Niethamer is an adjunct faculty member at CCAC, a Title I reading specialist for grades K through 6, provides professional development on culturally responsive teaching, is a member of her district's equity team, and serves on the board as a teacher liaison for RAMP, which is Raising Education in Monroeville and Pitcairn. Let's show some love, please. Yes.
Hi, thanks, Marc. I'm so honored to be here, and I can't wait to learn from everybody.
Oh, man, this is going to be a great conversation. We have here Kari Kokka, who is an assistant professor of math education in the School of Education here at University of Pittsburgh. She studies student and teacher perspectives of social justice, mathematics, and STEM teacher activism. She's been an educator for the last 25 years, and her most influential teaching experiences were learned during her 10 years as a mathematics teacher organizer at Vanguard High School, which is a public Title I New York City high school and part of the Coalition of Essential Schools and New York Performance Standards Consortium. She is co-founder of the Creating Balance in an Unjust World Conference on STEAM education and social justice, former co-chair of the Critical Educators for Social Justice SIG at AERA, and has been part of the radical STEM educators of the Bay Area, People's Education Movement, and the New York Collective of Radical Educators. So Kari gets in all kinds of good trouble. She completed her EDD at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, her MA with the Stanford Teacher Education Program, and her BS in Mechanical Engineering at Stanford University. Round of applause, please. Yes, yes, yes. Now, it ain't often, people like me don't get invited places back more than once. So I don't know what this is like, but when you do a good job and you got something to offer and you got that kind of brilliance, you get invited twice. We were lucky enough to have Harmony McDonald here the first time. And Harmony has more insights to offer. And I'm so grateful that y'all who missed it the first week get to hear from Harmony this time. Harmony is a Pittsburgh Public Schools graduate, an eloquent spoken word artist, and has a passion for humanity. She is unapologetic in her fight for Black life, and Harmony's activism is demonstrated through her voice, her brilliance, and courage within organizing and protesting in Pittsburgh. So show some love for Harmony McDonald. Yes.
Hi, thank you, everyone.
Thank you for coming back, Harmony. We have Monica Ruiz, who is the executive director at Casa San Jose. Ruiz holds a master's degree in social work with a focus on community organizing and social action. She earned her bachelor's degree in social work from the University of Pittsburgh with a concentration in psychology. Ruiz is a powerful advocate for Latinos on legal, housing, development, and educational issues. And she fights for those facing deportation proceedings and launches projects to assist women, children, and youth. In addition, she partners with political, labor, religious, and law enforcement leadership to make Pittsburgh stronger and more welcoming to all. Monica Ruiz, please, round of applause. Yes. And finally, last and certainly not least, we have Muffy Mendoza, who is the founder, creative, and businesswoman behind Brown Mamas, which is a sisterhood that connects thousands of moms with resources, advice, and best of all, each other. Muffy has created a line of educational books and products focused on helping Black moms be the best moms. Her first book, The Brown Mama Mindset, a blueprint for Black homes on life, love, and home, was featured at the Essence Festival and is currently sold in various cities across the U.S. Muffy champions the beauty and complexities of the Black mothering experience everywhere she goes, even on the TEDx stage. She received a standing ovation at the inaugural TEDx Strip District after giving a compelling depiction of modern day motherhood. And after TEDx, she went on to create a stage for other Black moms. That same year, she debuted the first annual Brown Mama Monologues, which is a showcase which went to hundreds of people. To date, the series is hosted in 2 cities, Pittsburgh and the DC metro region, with the hopes of becoming, and it will, a multi-city showcase. She was nominated for the prestigious Iris Award in 2018 for the outstanding work she's done as a writer, influencer, and content creator on brownmamas.com. And when she's low-key, she loves reading African history books, forcing her kids to watch the most boring documentaries, which really aren't boring. That's the best part. And snuggling with her #1 supporter and husband, Mr. Mac Mendoza. You can learn more about Muffy by going to brownmamas.com. If you go to brownmamas.com, you get so much more. Let's show some love for Muffy. All right, family. Let's talk a little bit about what's been going on. It's been my practice over the last few weeks to begin with the question of where y'all are. You know, I never want to sort of delve into the outer analysis before we begin sort of with the self. How are y'all feeling? Where are y'all emotionally? How have the last few months and maybe even the last few weeks been for you? How are you making out with all of this? Anybody can jump in, but I'd like to hear from all 6 of you on this question. Maybe we'll start with Amil. Amil, unmute yourself, my brother.
I feel like I'm in a great space right now. You know, it's hard to say that the world's been in a lot of turmoil and crises, but I feel like I'm adjusting to it, and you know, even going into this new school year. I mean, basically, we know that we're going into one of the craziest years that we've ever experienced. So I'm kind of like in a battle mindset, being ready mentally for everything that can go wrong, being ready emotionally to try to be there to support the students and myself and my family. So, I mean, thankfully, I'm healthy and in a strong space, but I'm privileged, right? So I want to acknowledge that, you know what I mean? And what I have is a blessing. It's not all deserved, and a lot of other people don't have that. So I'm just trying to be here to be able to support to others as I support myself.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. That makes sense. Janet?
I feel like Amil. I'm ready to go. Some days I'm more anxious than others, but mostly I'm worried about elderly people like my father or my niece with asthma. But I'm grateful to be healthy. I'm grateful to be employed. And like Amil said, to be privileged. Mostly I'm having good days, a few bad, a few upset days when I, watch the news and see what's really happening. But as a wise person once told me, I'm insisting on joy.
I like that. Insisting on joy. Kari?
So I don't like to think about my emotions.
Fair.
And so I think that has been my trauma response, right? Is to just I'm just going to stay in my work and I'm going to write. I'm on my pre-tenure hustle. I do feel encouraged, I would say, by folks, mainstream dominant folks, becoming on board with abolitionists, anti-racism. And so I'm excited for the conversation today.
That's actually quite helpful. Harmony?
Yeah, it's been a lot of ups and downs for me. I think I'm at a pretty consistent up right now, which is great, and hopefully that lasts for a long time. I think I started out this whole pandemic situation just kind of taking it one day at a time and playing video games constantly. And now I'm sort of at the point where I can recognize the, albeit, pandemic is an unfortunate situation, but recognize the benefit that I have from all this time. And I think at first I was discouraged because 2020 was not supposed to turn out this way for any of us, I think. And this was supposed to be the year that I, get myself together, and it's been roughly 10 years since I was diagnosed from depression, and I graduated from high school last year, and so this was like really supposed to be a good year for me. And it wasn't at first, I think, but now it finally is becoming that, because I'm sort of taking control of my own life and realizing that this pandemic and life doesn't just have to happen to me, and I can sort of take control and I don't know, be the master of my own universe, or whatever people say. But yeah, it's been good. I'm good, and yeah, I'm excited to be here.
I like that idea. It doesn't have to just happen to me. I'm going to use that in my own thinking and processing of the world. Monica Ruiz.
Well, I am extremely overwhelmed. I have been working harder than I've ever worked in my entire life.
Just really trying to be present for the community, my family, myself. Really thinking about, I have kids, like little ones, and I am not a teacher, so my hat goes off to all the educators here. I've got 5th grade, 7th grade, 11th grade, so I don't know what's going to happen to my poor children coming the next school year, but prioritizing things that, safety first, and just trying to make sure that we're all well and doing the best that we can to make, the lives of our family and the families that we serve much better.
And thank you, Muffy.
Well, I'm gonna break up the monotony a bit, because I am a reckless optimistic, and I'm seeing so many dope things happening in the Black community right now. I'm seeing Susu happening. I'm seeing Black people cashing out thousands of dollars every week by putting their money collectively together, individuals. I'm seeing a whole bunch of parents reaching out to me about homeschooling, unschooling, self-directed learning, and being interested in getting engaged in their kids' lives in a way that they never could before. I'm seeing tons of Black moms taken to the streets and really demanding the justice that we should have always, or we've always been demanding for our kids. So I'm a reckless optimistic, because I'm looking at the implications of all the things that are happening. And I mean, just even on this panel, there's 5 women and 2 men. Like, for the first time in American history, Black women are able to decide whether they want to just be mothers or whether they want to be a mom, a businesswoman, a nonprofit owner. There's so many reasons to be optimistic right now if you're a part of the Black community in particular, because there's just so many ways in which we've been forced to unravel to begin to ravel ourselves back together again in a way that really may make us whole. So I'm optimistic.
I am sharing your optimism against the backdrop of the other stuff. Cervantes talked about the optimism of the optimism of the will, the pessimism of the spirit, or the optimism of the intellect, the pessimism of the spirit. So I'm always kind of battling the tensions between what I think is possible and the realities on the ground that we struggle with. And I'm watching everybody sort of try and, make sense of all this stuff. In March, we got hit with COVID-19 as a nation. We got hit sooner, but by March, there were some abrupt stoppages here in Pennsylvania, where we both all live, at least Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, where I am. There was a very clear moment where businesses shut down, schools shut down, and we didn't know exactly what things would look like. And yet, y'all were still asked to work. Parents at homeschool had to keep going. People that worked in school districts had to keep going. They just had to keep going through distance learning, right? But it was like, y'all need to work. Students were told they still had to go to school. And so much was left to us to figure out as a university professor. Our semester didn't stop. It just changed. And so there's all this stuff that happened in March. And the first thing I kind of wanted to know was the extent to which you all, in your own experience as educators, and in your experience working with educators, did you feel supported? Did you feel like the local school districts were supportive? Do you feel like the government was supportive of the work you had to do? I don't mean in general, but I mean specifically as it relates to the question of teaching and the question of teaching and learning. Did you feel supported anybody can jump in. I can call on folk, but I want y'all to kind of jump in when the spirit moves. Yeah, go ahead, Muffy.
I just want to say that I just want to set some ground level here and recognize, at least if you're in the city of Pittsburgh, I don't know, I can only speak for living in the city of Pittsburgh, but from the aspect of a community creator and a mom who shepherds a community of thousands of women, they didn't feel supported, but by the local school districts. But I don't know that they ever felt supported by the local school districts. So I just want to point that out, that I feel like the level of support that our community received was no different than the level of support they received pre-COVID-19. Because we know that in our community here in Pittsburgh, historically, our school district does not do a good job of educating Black children, and it has continued through the pandemic to not do a good job of educating Black children.
That's an important point, Harmony. Let me bring you in here, Harmony, because I mean that's one of the things I know you've thought and talked about. That even before we get to the response of the school districts and the state more broadly to COVID, there's a way that the system itself, to Muffy's point, has always been unfair. That by design, that the structure itself yields uneven and sometimes race driven outcomes, right? Harmony, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I fully agree with what Mrs. Mendoza said. I definitely have seen that like all throughout my academic career, but especially in high school, because I was trying to work directly with the superintendent, Anthony Hamlet. And there were many instances where genuine problems and genuine concerns we had were, sort of put over and pushed to the side, or maybe covered up with a Band-Aid or something, or they'd, take a picture with us while we were at school and maybe show up to one of our events and sort of say that they were fixing the problem by doing that. But I think one thing that this pandemic is doing, not just with schools, but the entire systemic structure of America, is showing how faulty and flimsy it is, and how easily it can be destroyed, and how much it hurts African American communities instead of helps them like it claims to. So yeah, I definitely agree. I think that I never expected the school board to be helpful because they never have been. So yeah, those are my thoughts, I guess.
No, that's super important. Yeah, jump on in, bro.
All right, I wanted to mention that one of the main issues I think related directly to the students I work with was technology. I think that students haven't been, especially in our Black communities, they haven't been emphasized to like bring your own device. Really, we kind of look at our students with technology from an oppressive lens, like restrict their use of devices, restrict their social networking capabilities, and heavily police them in a way in which they're not foster how to properly use them and enhance what they're already doing. So we haven't embraced the devices in the classroom. Then now the classroom is closed. So now you want us to learn using these devices. Then a lot of students had different devices. Like some students probably just only had a cell phone device, didn't have a Chromebook or a laptop. A Chromebook is really not a replacement for a desktop or a laptop, and then
can you say why, just for those that don't know these distinctions?
Yeah, to go into a little bit of background or a little bit more complexity. I mean, what a Chromebook is it's really a glorified web browser. Okay, it's a glorified web browser that has web applications that you can use on it, but it doesn't do robust computing programming. You can't run, I believe it's x86 based applications on a Chromebook. So you can't use Photoshop. You can't use there's limitations to it. I mean, you can work around the limitations, but there's some significant limitations to performance. But Chromebook is better than different situations. So it gets real murky. And I think that a lot of our students, access to technology was an issue, access to Wi-Fi, access to internet. and even just the skills to navigate it. And for real, technology causes a lot of people stress. I mean, there's studies on techno stress. There's studies on these things that become oppressive, right? So now we want students to go and check their school email. They're getting 100 notifications, I guarantee, their inboxes of every time any comment is made on a classroom assignment, any notification. You know, they're already dealing with anxiety. So the social emotional component to their lives is being enhanced and even triggered by the way we use technology. So I want to mention that. And when it comes to servicing our kids, that ball was dropped big time, I believe, personally.
No, that's helpful. And the reason I was asking you about that Chromebook is because some of the discourse I hear is about sort of responding to the home challenges by giving kids technology or giving away laptops. And then when we scratch beneath the surface and we find out that, you know, kids got laptops, they got Chromebooks. And like you said, it's a web browser that in some ways, sometimes their cell phones are probably more powerful than what they're able to do with the Chromebook, which is just a marker of sort of what the technology gaps are and how these technology gaps, which precede COVID-19, then become challenges after COVID-19. Janet, can you talk a little bit about that? Sort of how we get. Yeah.
Well, in my district, we're in the suburbs of Pittsburgh, about 15 miles out, and we were able to get a device, Chromebook, or an iPad to every family, at least when, you know, the crisis happened in March. Mm-hmm. And, you know, as a professional, I felt supported by our administration. I had a really strong principal at the time, and they had us do a lot of online trainings to help us get our Google Classrooms together and assignments. And they also rolled that out a couple weeks later to give us time to prepare. And yes, so next year, I believe it'll be one-on-one, not just one per. Some families had more than one device, but every family had one. So, and I know we spoke a brief second yesterday, Harmony, about zip code privileges, and it's evidenced here, definitely in my district. But next year we're getting iPads, I believe, K-8, new ones, and then Chromebooks from 9 to 12, because some of the Chromebooks are older. But, you know, when the crisis happened and the governor shut down the school, that was the best we could do at that time.
Well, that's pretty daggone good, you know. And again, that zip code privilege, I think, is an important thing to talk about. And, you know, Harmony's talked about it. You've talked about it. You know, this idea that we have conceded as an article of faith in this country, almost, that poor people get poor schools, and that, you know, your property taxes and the amount of economic investment that's been placed in your neighborhood is a reasonable predictor of how much money your school's going to get. That if you're wealthy, you get a good school. If you're poor, you don't. And because that has become common sense, even some of our interventions, you know, Title I and other forms of federal interventions, don't level the playing field. You know, some people get doors and other people get computer labs or photography centers, even with those interventions. And that's important. And I'm glad you all sort of pushed me in this direction, and please continue to jump in. I know Kari and others haven't jumped in yet, but, you know, this is key. You know, so much of our conversation about COVID and the crisis of COVID and the crisis of state violence begins at that moment of crisis and doesn't look at all the factors that get us there, in the same way that you can't talk about COVID-19 without talking about a person's pre-existing conditions. Because they shape how your body will respond to COVID. As a nation, the pre-existing conditions of white supremacy, the pre-existing conditions of the contradictions of capitalism, the pre-existing conditions of these huge gaps in technology, these huge gaps in health access, these huge gaps in access to housing or food security. These shape how people engaged the crisis of COVID, or the crisis of police violence, right? So these are all problems, and in some ways we could probably even struggle or wrestle with the language of crisis, right? Which oftentimes frames things as ephemeral or as momentary, as opposed to seeing it as sort of baked into the DNA. So this summer series is about crisis pedagogy. What do we do in the moment of crisis? So I think this summer series is on the money. But we have to look at this crisis against the backdrop, not of more crisis, but against the backdrop of structures that don't work. And you all have been doing a great job of pushing me to think about that. So anyway, let's keep I don't want to keep talking. Let's keep things going. Kari, or whoever wants to jump in.
Marc, can I say something? I'm sorry.
And Monica, whoever.
Okay. I mean, I just wanted to add, to the conversation is one of the things that we are really struggling with is the lack of language access. And so the vast majority of the folks that we serve don't speak English. And so even trying to get basic information out to those families was very difficult. And we found ourselves, doing the job of, the school districts, of the health departments, of all these entities that, showed us at that moment that they didn't care about us. They didn't care about our families because they made no effort to try to get this information out to our families. And then that has just been continuing to move in that direction because now CASA, not only did we have to buy, laptops for the students that we work with, but now we have to get, because the families don't speak English, we have to get them connected to the Wi-Fi, which sometimes doesn't work. And now we're purchasing mobile hotspots that we're going to have to pay for in order for kids to be able to access school. And I really think that that's not the responsibility of a small nonprofit organization, that I think that other better funded organizations, government agencies, entities of what sort, should be taking on that role. But, this is just people falling through the cracks that are going to continue to do that because I can't imagine. I mean, I referenced my 3 kids and I struggle with them and I speak English, right? And so we work with so many families that don't. I cannot imagine what it's going to be like for those families trying to access education and resources for their children in this upcoming school year.
Monica, can you say a little bit more about the specific challenges that people emerge? So March comes. What specific messaging was out there that they couldn't access, and what information could they not get, and what were some of the problems that came from them not being able to get it?
So anything about schools closing, anything at all was not translated into different languages.
Wow.
And so parents had no idea what to do. And then once we started advocating for those, it took months. And so we took that role. We're not translators, we're not interpreters, but we had to take on that role so that our communities could be knowledgeable on what was happening because everything was changing so quickly. And at the end of the day, the ones that suffered were the students, right? Because many of them, because it wasn't a priority, it made it seem to the children like their education wasn't a priority. So many of them never engaged, right? And so what are we going to do to change that narrative so that kids can get their education moving forward? So that was just one of the problems. And then not taking into consideration that, we work with many families that are recent arrivals. And many of them cannot read and write in their own language. So what are we doing? Again, when we're translating things, we use a lot of pictures. We go above and beyond because the education of our families and our children are really, really important. And so we're taking these extra steps that, some of the school districts are not.
Oh, so I'm sorry, my audio went out. This has to be is there no law? Is there nothing that where this should be? This is illegal to me.
Yes, it is illegal. It is illegal. But it was quote unquote in a pandemic and everybody was up in their work. And I said to somebody once, I said to them, you know what? I've been working at CASA for 5 years, and for 5 years I've been screaming at the top of my lungs about language access. And I thought I was doing a really good job, but this is a blatant slap in the face to tell me I wasn't doing a good job and or you really don't care about the communities that we represent.
Wow. Kari, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, what I was going to say is that this is all intentional. It's social reproduction. It's what Muffy was saying, right? That nothing was good in the first place. Redlining was intentional. School funding is tied to local property taxes, which Harmony mentioned on our call yesterday. Tracking practices when IQ tests were being designed, when women and people of color started to do well. Oh, we need to change the test because that's not what the outcome is supposed to be, right? And so all of these things are intentional. I mean, even once we do have access to technology, I'm a math educator, and the literature and mathematics education teaching is not the way that most classrooms are taught. It's not direct instruction. It's small group work. Students will work on a problem for a really long period of time. If you look at the trends in mathematics and science studies, if you look at other countries, a lot of the other high achieving countries, that's what they do. A student will present, people will engage in a conversation. And so, you know, I just have questions around how are we going to do that type of instruction. I don't have answers to that question, but it just worries me a lot, especially because we know that privileged students during this time are hiring people to tutor them one-on-one, whereas other kids in other places are literally just getting packets, right? Packets and no support at all. Wow.
So you're actually pushing us in a direction I wanted to go. So, and I'm going to start back with you, Kari, so we can think through this question of teaching. Again, educators were asked to educate during this time. They were asked to educate, Kari, before the crisis. I'm curious to know how the jobs and responsibilities changed. Like we're all teachers, right? But there's a way that something was asked differently, either implicitly or explicitly, right? Like there's a way that we all were suddenly told to be distance educators. You know, there was suddenly a way that we all were taught to just make Zoom our classroom, and that was just it, right? And that was sort of an explicit ask. But then there's ways that sort of implicitly, there was just an expectation that we're supposed to do something different. And then there are ways that I think maybe it wasn't fully anticipated just how differently our professional lives would be once this stuff happened. I mean, the world just went upside down for so many of us. Kari, can you help us think through this a little bit?
Sure. I mean, I can speak from the perspective of a teacher educator. So I work with math and science pre-service teachers, and because of the University of Pittsburgh, they're placed in both more affluent school districts as well as more historically disinvested school districts. I saw that range of, you know, and some of my student teachers weren't really doing anything because the kids were just getting packets and they weren't able to interact with their students, whereas the other school districts, like Janet mentioned, were right on it, right? And so they were doing this instruction. Kids had office hours with their teachers. I think Nakaya spoke a little bit about her experience on the first webinar about her experience with that type of instruction. But I'd be really curious to hear about the practicing K-12 experiences also.
I'll share a little bit about my experience. It was very challenging because like we were told to give our students a little bit of time, like to kind of just, there was a break in the instruction. Then we were told that we were allowed to communicate with them, and it was just real procedural. And I think that a lot of school administrations, they really focus on the legal situation, not getting sued, making sure we follow different statutes and things like that. And it put those as priorities instead of like reaching out to the kids. Because I don't know if you guys heard about the Zoom meetings getting hacked or, you know, people doing inappropriate things. So then it was like, oh, let's not use this solution. So our kids were left in limbo as they dealt with the legal dilemma as to whether they could use it. What if a teacher has something inappropriate in the background? What if all these things that got in the way of us immediately building that routine and getting our kids engaged as quickly as possible to build the learning community that we needed. Hold
on, Amil, I want you to, because you mentioned it, but I want you to unpack that a little bit for me. When you say the legal stuff, are you saying that the school was responsive to concerns about potential, injuries, legal injuries, legal?
I think that seemed to be
but why? What happened?
Focus.
What made the school suddenly say, "Look, be careful on Zoom"?
I mean, I don't know. I don't know if it was the same with other schools, but I think there was a thing like, don't talk about COVID in the classrooms, even in the instruction. Don't address it like in fear that you might say the wrong thing, like kind of like just this. And I think that this exists in urban education. It's kind of like this this notion, even like before COVID, right? Don't connect with your students on social media. Don't add them. Like that's a barrier, that's a line. But then now COVID hits and you can't even get in contact with students because they're not checking their school email. So the only students that you can connect with is ones that you might have an offline connection with. You know what I'm saying? So I don't know if that answered your question, but.
No, it did. It absolutely did. It's incredibly helpful to think about sort of what the priorities of the school were, right? Because I mean that's a key part of it. Janet, what were you witnessing in terms of sort of how did your job change? How did your responsibilities change? How much of it was explicitly sort of expressed to you? How much of it just happened? You know, what was going on?
Well, my perspective, I'm a K-6 Title I reading specialist, so I don't have my own homeroom, and everything I do is elementary based. And there's a huge difference between kindergarten and sixth grade, and also not having my own classroom. Suddenly we were, you know, IT specialists, and you know, if Amil was stressed out and he's a tech guru, imagine how a regular teacher like me felt. But I felt supported because my colleagues and I got together and we shared stuff. And in my role, I supported teachers K-6 by helping them create digital lessons, offering them websites or games. If they, you know, if we shared a student, they'd reach out to me, hey, have you heard from so-and-so? She hasn't logged in since April. So I make a phone call. I reach out to the guidance. So we had a lot going on. But yeah, we were definitely all thrown into the whole digital aspect of teaching, which I would guess that high school teachers had more familiarity with because they did do a lot of assignments and stuff with the older kids.
Yeah.
But you can't just give a first grader an iPad and say, log on to your Google Classroom and do what your teacher says. And I do know that.
Let me ask you, as a reading specialist, so people have a sense of what you were doing before COVID, right? Particularly in the type of district you have. Were you doing reading assessments? Were you doing like interventions? Were you pulling kids out of classrooms to do one-on-one? Like what kind of stuff were you doing before? Because I'm trying to get a sense of sort of how it looks, because it seems like you were put into very much a supportive role for classroom teachers afterward, and that much of your job was like follow-up and supplemental stuff.
Yes.
But I'm trying to also get a sense, I want people to get a sense of what was at stake here, what was lost from what you used to do till then.
Well, pre-COVID, I did all the things you said. I did assessments. I pushed into classrooms to support teachers and students. And I also did small group lessons to help reinforce and remediate and boost up some achievement for children in their reading. So yeah, and we were directed to not give additional assessments. Again, with the crisis, we didn't want to overwhelm our students and our families with more reading assignments, but the kids who needed, you know, the reading instruction the most missed out because I'm sending them, you know, find the adjective game or, you know, click on the right sight word game because the direct instruction piece was lost. I do know that some of my friends in special ed set up Zoom meetings and the speech teachers had one-on-one Zoom sessions with their students. I also spoke to a parent that said, you know, 30 minutes a week on Zoom isn't enough for my daughter. So we had a lot of work to do, and hopefully come this fall, depending on what the governor says and how COVID is in the Pittsburgh area, we can fill in some of these gaps and move forward stronger. It's definitely a challenge.
Yeah. It's also sort of helpful to think about, as you mentioned yourself, the sort of arrangement of resources that were there so that you could be able to say, hey, I'll supplement this classroom teacher. Hey, I can reach out to the guidance counselor. Things that all schools should have, but often, you know, due to staffing issues, resource issues, not everyone has those resources. And sometimes people are scrambling to get their most basic needs met. And the fact that even in a place where people have more than that, there was still a gap here, you know, and that there were needs that need to be filled because it happened on such short notice. It's interesting to think about, to your point, how someone like Amil or elsewhere, you know, where the resources are less plentiful and where conditions are even more sort of urgent in certain ways, how they may have responded or had to navigate that stuff. Harmony, I mean, I want to bring Harmony back in here. Harmony, you have friends who were going through this. You have friends who are going to school. You have friends who had just graduated. You have some friends who are going off to college. You know, did they talk about sort of how they experience school or how they experience their teachers during this time?
Yeah, a little bit. I still had some friends that were going to high school at the time and some friends in college, and they all mostly seem to echo the idea of like they never were really able to like plant their feet ever, because it seemed like there was never really a concrete plan, even up until they, graduated or the school year ended. It definitely seemed like, whether or not they were going to be able to learn in roughly the same way. Of course, it would be difficult, but in some sort of the same way was never really answered. And I definitely think that it seemed like they all agreed that the work quality, like the schoolwork quality, definitely decreased a lot since they had to learn virtually. So that's basically what I heard from them.
Muffy, thank you. Muffy, let me bring you in as well, because everybody's homeschooling now, whether we want to or not. Help me think about homeschooling as not just an option that you take up when the school shuts down, but it's something that parents have done for a very long time. Particularly many Black and brown folk have made the decision to homeschool for political reasons, for cultural reasons, etc. And sort of, are there some lessons that we could learn from homeschooling parents about how to navigate this stuff when suddenly we all, whether we want to or not, are becoming homeschoolers?
I think you have to center the child. Most homeschooling parents, so a lot of Black homeschooling parents, we start off in cyber school because we don't know what to do. Like I started off with my kids in cyber school because I had no idea what homeschooling was about. And I very quickly learned that that is not an experience that centers children, because asking a child to sit in front of a computer for more than an hour is torture for them. They become antsy, the workload becomes too much. It's a lot of boxes to check. It's a lot of screens to read. And it's not an experience just like the current educational system experience that we have. It's not an experience that centers children. And so I think that what we're really going to have to talk about is trusting kids and beginning to bring kids into these conversations and have their voices heard. And soon as COVID hit, my inbox like blew up with people reaching out about homeschooling. And the saddest part of that for me was realizing that most of these parents had not spent any substantial amount of time with their children, enough to know that their children would be okay. I identify as both a homeschooling parent and an unschooling parent. And when I tell you my kids learn organically, I'm telling you they learn organically.
Can you define unschooling? Can you define unschooling for those that don't know?
So unschooling is basically having a curiosity-led learning experience. So my kids learn based on their curiosities. They don't learn based on do this, read this, explore this. Our relationship is more of a one that is question-based, where I am constantly questioning them to find out what they want to experience and the things that they want to learn, so that I can utilize that in developing learning experiences for them, versus forcing information down their throats that they may or may not need in the future. And so I think we just have to begin to really look at what's best for kids. And until we do that, we're going to continue to spin our wheels in an inherently broken system that's really not broken when we're honest with ourselves. Any educator who's done even just a little bit of research in terms of the beginnings of the schooling system here in America knows that the system is working exactly the way it was always meant to work. The problem is that the people have outgrown the system and no one has gone back in to say, hey, this screw doesn't fit here anymore. Maybe we need to try a new, crafting a new hole or something, because it doesn't matter if there's COVID-19 or not, if the system just doesn't work. And the reason why most Black homeschoolers are homeschooling is not because it has a lot to do with politics, it has a lot to do with culture, but most of us are rejecting the way in which our children are being taught. We don't want our children to be slaves on a plantation. We want to raise free adults who understand that they have the ability to critically think and critically get themselves out of any situation, and they have the opportunity to be masters of their own reality.
Did your job as a homeschooling and unschooling mother or parent rather change after COVID, or was it pretty much fairly steady for you?
Besides my kids not being able to do their activities that they normally do, it pretty much stayed the same. And honestly, once COVID-19 hit, it gave me even more of an opportunity to relax in my schooling. And really more of an opportunity for my kids to have some more agency in their own lives. Because if you're familiar at all with the unschooling movement, it's a process of constantly not only deschooling yourself or unschooling yourself, but unschooling your whole household, and recognizing that these ideas that we have around competition, performance, learning because somebody said we should, are all false, and that you actually need to learn to live a life of learning. So I wouldn't say that it changed very much outside of not being able to leave the house.
Monica, can I bring you in a little bit?
Absolutely.
What changed for you? Or did it?
I mean, again, you know, it was a complete change. It's very difficult to run a nonprofit organization from your living room while your children are jumping around. And I have 2 kids in the Pittsburgh Public School district and then 1 child in a different district. And there was just such a huge difference in the way that the approach was and the way that learning was happening. You know, with my 2 kids in Pittsburgh Public Schools, I was running around trying to get information, trying to get something. Every 5 minutes they needed help with something. I couldn't. I was working full time. I couldn't, you know, give them the dedication and time that they needed. And my 2 children that are in Pittsburgh Public Schools are also ESL. And so again, you know, 11th, at that point he was in the 10th grade. You're trying to get 10th grade. So I had to read it in English, 10th grade work. And I'm kind of bright, right? But like, I don't remember what I was doing in the 10th grade, right? And then it translated to him, get the answer from him in Spanish, and then read it back in English. I can't do that. I can't do that.
I couldn't agree anymore with what Muffy was saying. You know, these systems were created in this way for a reason, right? We're systemically not set up to succeed. We are systemically set up to fail. And this is a perfect example of how those systems continue to work against people of color.
I want to talk a little bit about, in light of that, sort of how your teaching practices shifted and changed. How did, and this is for all of you who are engaged in education practice, how did your mode of delivery change? How did your mode of instruction change? How did your practices change? What did you witness? Because something I would imagine changed. Maybe Janet, we could start with you.
Well, everything changed. It was more student choice for me. In some of the lessons that I helped teachers with, choose one of these stories, then respond to it by A, B, or C. Everything was online. I recorded myself reading stories aloud, and what's lacking was the interaction, which, you know, that's the connection we need, and that's how a lot of kids learn. So another thing was that it did free us up to be more creative and gave us more freedom. And for me, when I was supporting teachers with lessons, everything I did was culturally responsive to, I know a lot of us struggle with that. So I was very intentional on providing that type of instruction and activities for my students and the people I helped. Did I answer the question?
No, you absolutely did. Yeah.
Okay.
Other folk.
I would say like my teaching strategy, it definitely changed because I'm like really big on building relationships and having, like Janet mentioned, those interactions with students, but I had to just kind of like wing it and be creative. So I tried to like change my mindset and think that every student is at least on a mobile device. So I changed how I kind of like structure my lessons around students having at least access to a mobile device. And so with those students at first, I used like Loom. It's something called Loom to give feedback, like screenshots and feedback of the work that students did. I use a lot of video, like vlogging, kind of like just give a recap, speak to the students, just keep it real. My students know me, so like they know I can't just come into class. I gotta I give them a little bit of my personality and then just post it up and so they can interact with it. And then I would give them video feedback. But it is much less interaction, and you kind of have to like do whatever you can do to interact with them and find them on different platforms. So some students, I couldn't get them in Google Classroom. I had to get them on Instagram. I had to get them on Twitter. I had to get them whatever way that I knew how to get them, or a text message, check in on them through another colleague. So like, where's this person at? But then we also, like, when we was addressing like in the COVID situation, then we had like Ahmaud Arbery happen, you know? So of course we're bringing that discussion to the table. Then unfortunately, George Floyd happened right after that. So there was definitely like importance of bringing important discussions like that to the table. So I definitely included those type of things in my content as well. But it was weighing heavy on me, and I tried to keep that in mind as I spoke to the students on the online instruction.
Absolutely. No, and we're going to, in a moment, pivot to talk about George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and others, because I think there's something very important about this idea of state violence and insecurity and unsafety and vulnerability that our students are feeling that aren't just about COVID, but are about these other factors. I want to drill down just a little bit more, though, on this question of your teaching practices, because I think part of what some of the people who are watching this are thinking about is sort of, what do I, in a moment of crisis, do as educator? Kari, maybe I could bring you in as someone who trains teachers. I mean, you not only work with pre-service teachers, but you also are in conversation with in-service teachers. And beyond that, you're an expert on teaching. And so as you think about what you would tell a classroom full of in-service teachers, you know, at this moment, you can't do the same thing. We can't teach the same way we've always taught. What should change? What should we be thinking about? What factors should be on our minds as we talk about the shift in our practice pre and post COVID?
So very similar to Amil. I mean, I think that relationships are the most important thing. And luckily, the group of students that I was teaching in the spring, I had also taught them in the fall. And all of my classes, we start with a check-in. So everyone does a check-in. I had invited my students to my home. I had cooked for them in December. So I was pretty close to them. And they also all had devices because they were master's students at the University of Pittsburgh. Because I was worried about their missing out on their graduation, I printed like fake. I made them not too similar because I didn't want to get in trouble. My students were like, this should be your side hustle. I said, no, you can't say that. They don't look that similar to the diploma. And then we did the Don't Rush Challenge. So like I made a video and I had them do that as kind of like a celebratory thing. But I did a lot of one-on-one meetings with them, because the thing that I really missed with virtual was the like walking by someone's desk and saying like, oh my gosh, you told me about this student. Like, how's your student doing that you told me about? Like all of those check-ins that I would do normally, I wasn't able to. And I think moving forward, I mean, the thing that's really interesting is what Amil was mentioning about these online communities that students have. And there are, you know, legal issues around those type of things that I don't know, you know, are the laws going to be able to change for kids who are under 18 in order to have those relationships with students. But I do think that, Harmony, you probably have something to say about this. I just think that our young people are already doing this, and so probably have a lot of advice for the educators.
One, and I want Harmony to jump back in too. But let me ask you one more question, Kari. I mean, how important is the knowledge of tech, the knowledge of social media, things, part of, what we're taught in teacher education programs, is content knowledge. And, and we get some pedagogical knowledge, and we even get some pedagogical content knowledge, right? We learn how to teach math or how to teach English. But if we did it, in my day, I went through a teacher education program. I took teaching methods, I don't know, in 1998, so there was no social media. We weren't even Googling stuff. So, how does a teacher who's now a veteran teacher, who cares about engagement, who cares about pedagogy, and is interested in doing this, but suddenly we try to figure out how to work the Zoom, and now all of a sudden you're talking about Don't Rush, the Don't Rush challenge, which is amazing, and I'm really, really trying to figure out how to do the Zoom with my camera on. How do we close those gaps, and how do we intervene in ways that are helpful in a moment of crisis?
Yeah, that's a big question, because the other thing too is that even when you're trying to help someone learn technology, we're all doing it virtually. Right? So you're not even sitting with the person at their computer, or this is the button that you push, or once you go here, then you're going to see the drop-down menu. And honestly, when I was teaching, I had an overhead projector. And then we switched to, I had a Promethean board, active whiteboard, and I didn't know how to use it. So my students taught me how to use it. Right. And so that's why I was saying, like, I really believe that it's our young people who can teach the adults how to use that technology. And also, this is a time where we literally don't know the answers. Like, no one has studied this before. No one has been through this before, aside from those people who lived to be 100 and some odd years old, from the pandemic a long time ago. But yeah, I think that's a really, really great question. And like I mentioned earlier, I'm especially interested in that question for mathematics. Oh, I'm sorry for the interpretation that I'm talking so quickly.
Other people, anyone want to jump on this question before I pivot? Muffy, yeah, please jump on in.
Yeah, I think we really have to start to trust kids. Like, I think that prior to COVID and now post-COVID, we're in a situation where we have to start to trust kids more. Like, we have to start to trust them to know that they know how to use the technology way better than we do. They know what their interests are. They understand how to create relationship with adults and other kids in order to get the information and access to the information that they need. So I think we're in a space where we really need to lean into trusting kids and lean into the fact that children are not handicapped. Like, they're just adults with less experience. So for that reason, we do have good reason, knowing what they're going to grow into, to trust them in creating some of these learning opportunities for themselves. So just like Amil said with the Don't Rush challenge, like, do you know how much a kid is learning during a Don't Rush challenge? They're learning how to edit video. They're learning how to do a voiceover. Like, these are legit jobs that people get paid for. So why can't we trust kids knowing that they know, in fact, they are smarter than us. They may not be wiser than us, but because they're living every day in a society and absorbing way more information than we're absorbing, they know how to behave and how to navigate this society. And we have to begin to trust them more to engage in real ways.
I want to add on to what Muffy's saying, like, about trusting our youth, and also like tailoring our curriculum and our content around their lives, right? So we watch COVID. Now we listening to who's an essential worker, who's not an essential worker, who's actually risking their life to go into work, who doesn't have to, who can actually sit at home and earn a paycheck, and who cannot. And that actually is changing career outlooks, the future prospects of different majors and people's whole life trajectories in real time. So we have to be flexible, not dogmatic, and also understand that, everyone's career path can be impacted, especially you can work independently. So I got students who are entrepreneurs. They were out here making money, selling t-shirts to Instagram and doing thrifting, all kinds of things online tapping into the capital and the resources that's out there. And I think we really need to emphasize that. Because the educational model is like K to 12, then go to school for 4 years and then get a job. But we're in a crisis. That doesn't work. And that hasn't really been working effectively for many of our students already. So we really got to ignite and put a bigger emphasis on how to get kids ready for the workplace, the evolving workplace. So I love what Muffy's saying. Our kids are already interested in fashion vlogging. They're already interested in gaming. They already have thousands of followers many times in networks that they can learn how to monetize. And they know who the trendsetters are and different things like that. So tapping in with them and bringing the youth culture back into the classroom and into these online spaces, like that's essentially what we need to do. So it is a big learning curve for the adults. We got to get on board with the youngins.
So speaking of getting on board with
digital marketers are the ones who are making the most money right now.
Yeah. So finding a way to draw on those resources, I mean, is key. Harmony, let me bring you back in, since you are based on this standard, the one with the most insight on this topic. I mean, what kind of stuff is missing from education right now? What's missing from the classroom? What should teachers be thinking about? What should they be drawing on? What kind of stuff do you think would have made your high school experience more valuable and could make those of others after you more valuable?
So glad you asked. I was actually talking about this with some of my friends earlier, because this is something that I saw, again, all throughout my school career, but I think it's getting a bit worse now that students are learning from home. I think that, and I'm going to be speaking generally, but I'm pretty sure that it's safe to say that it's a pretty fair statement to say that every African-American child learns 2 languages growing up. They learn English, and then they learn AAVE, which is African-American Vernacular English. And I do consider that to be a real language because it's how we communicate with each other. And oftentimes, growing up in school, when we would be talking with each other and talking with our friends in a learning environment that's supposed to be comfortable, we were often scolded and told not to speak that way, or that's not how you say that word, or no, you speak like this, you speak properly. And I think that that's getting worse because, kids are learning from home. I think they're more comfortable. They're sitting in their bed, maybe they're texting their friends on their phone as well. So when they speak, that code switching doesn't really register as quickly as I think it does when you're in school. But I do think I would like to see more educators to recognize that as a language, and instead of just snapping at us and telling us to speak properly or whatever, because we know how to speak English. We code switch anytime we go to a job interview, anytime we talk to a principal for some reason. We know how to do it. That's something that we're very much aware of. And so it's unfortunate that that's still like a common thing that goes on. But I think now that we're getting more so in the age of technology, and I think again with like the Don't Rush challenge or like TikTok, I think it's very easy for teachers to sort of know our culture more and understand it and understand us from that perspective, as opposed to these are African American kids and they don't speak English and I need to teach them how to speak English. You know what I mean? So yeah, that's one thing.
No, let me ask you about another thing. I know because you've been a committed activist organizer, you've been thinking about so many things that are happening on the ground as well. And I want to kind of pivot to talk a little bit about the actions that have been taking place around Pittsburgh, that have been taking place really around the world around state violence. And I'm trying to think about how that also should be part of the school conversation. First of all, can you say a little bit about what's happening, and also maybe how schools can or should be involved?
Yeah, definitely. So with all the protests happening in America and, the current state of things, there's been a conversation of defunding the police, which is definitely something that I'm all for, taking the mass amount of funding that goes to the police and sending it to communities. I think one thing that I want students and like Black students to be a part of the conversation is where that funding goes to, I guess, because, you know, in schools in certain districts, when they get funding, they get better computers or newer textbooks or something like that, you know what I mean? But with the school where I went to, like University Prep, when we get funding, we get stronger security, or, you know, someone working in school to suspension, or packets, you know, more packets. So I definitely think that it would be nice, instead of just broadly saying, oh, more school funding, you know, we need more school funding in these areas, if we could actually recognize that historically this is where, or this is how our schools are funded, and try not to let history repeat itself, because then I feel like we're kind of just walking around in circles again, like we have been doing. And yeah, that's what I think.
No, that's super helpful. Let me bring in also Amil on this, and everyone, please. But Amil, I want to go to you because I know you're part of Hip Hop Ed, and one of the things that Hip Hop Ed has been attempting to do is weave these different areas of our lives together to think about what's happening in our cultural lives, our social lives, our economic lives, but to link that to the work of school. So how have schools responded to what's been happening in the streets from George Floyd forward? And to be clear, when I say George Floyd forward, it's not to say that this started with George Floyd, but that the national attention and the national kind of response came sort of after we saw George Floyd on tape for those 8 minutes and 46 seconds. It became like, oh my God. Then we look back at Breonna Taylor. Then we look forward. Then we paid more attention to Ahmaud Arbery, et cetera. But how can and should schools be thinking about this stuff?
I mean, I think that schools need to take this moment to really recognize the importance in addressing systemic racism, right? White supremacy, and really centering the curriculum. I just watched the president's interview where he was on there with Chris Wallace, and he talked about 1492 and not 1619, and tried to really dismiss the whole notion of the 1619 project, which really should be the foundational type of philosophy that happens in all type of civic education around this country for all American kids. And I think that needs to be a focus. So there's a curriculum right there for the 1619 project that's plug and play, essentially, that schools can implement immediately to begin to rectify and address the systemic racism and highlight, you know, the contributions that people of African descent, other indigenous communities have made, Latinos, Latinx folks. So that's what I think schools need to do. What's really going to happen is going to be interesting to see. And then to kind of piggyback on what Harmony was mentioning, like a lot of our students, they heavily policed in school environments. You know, these are institutions, and I work in an institution. So, I mean, I'm comfortable, you know, saying this, but like, I mean, now we're going to have temperature checks. I mean, kids already got to go through bag screenings, metal detectors, all these hurdles. Now they got to get screened. I mean, separation, mask on, in a lot of ways. To go back to Muffy's point, it's like I could see as a parent why I wouldn't want my kid to be subjected to that type of treatment, and how that can limit the benefit of the social interaction and the in-person instruction for young people. So I think that schools, if they're serious about addressing systematic racism and oppression, they need to be careful that they're not actually inflicting more of that. And we already know that schools have been one of the main institutions that cause oppression to young people. So we have to be real sensitive. You know, I really think that we have to really approach education from a more holistic, bigger emphasis on SEL, social emotional learning, bigger emphasis on being nimble and agile as the needs of our students change, whether it's career track, entrepreneurship needs to be in there, tech skills. You know, this code switching that Harmony also mentioned has to happen with tech. I mean, whether it's I'm dealing with a Spanish speaker or immigrants, foreign language speaker, foreign language learner, different communities have different language traditions and ways and modalities, and a lot of times the instruction that we get, whether it's how to get on the Wi-Fi, how to log on this app, how to perform this upload, it's not necessarily very easy for us to comprehend, and it needs to be broken down in a way that is effective for each particular community, right? You have engineers that design all these user experiences for people on the internet, but if we're not represented there in those, and as a diversity factor, then we're not designing it. So it's not designed for us. So I don't know. I'm kind of going on a tangent.
No. This is all, it's all connected and it's all helpful. Janet, I want to bring you in because I don't want to make you like the counterexample to all that's, in terms of like you being from a better resource place. But I'm also interested in thinking about what kind of conversations are happening, right? For example, in your district, of course, everyone's home, but there are nationwide protests. Cities are being shut down. The entire country's attention is fixed on the streets of Minneapolis and the streets of New York and Philadelphia, et cetera. Was there a mandate from the district? Was there something from the school? Was there any kind of conversation happening about what's happening in the outside world inside of school?
Our district sent a letter home to everybody. It came from central administration. They read it at a board meeting. And let me see, there was a quote about standing together and there's full support of our students and against acts of prejudice and racism, and will continue to relentlessly seek systemic and permanent change. So they did address it that way. They didn't specifically say police violence or Black Lives Matter or that, but they did recognize that we do need to stand together as one in full support of our students. And at the elementary level, it didn't really come up. Like the students didn't bring it up to me because, they're 7.
Right.
And I do know that our district also has an equity team that I'm part of. Each building has a smaller group, and then representatives from each building meet with central administration and the principals. And we are working on an equity policy, getting input from the high school's Black Student Union, and parents have been instrumental in helping our change, saying you need to say this and you need to say this, so real change can happen as far as the disparity in referrals and things like that. So as far as conversations between teachers and students and in the community, all I can say is we had that letter sent out. I can say that Monroeville, there was a family group that organized a children's rally that I attended with some other teachers. And that was lovely. It was nice to see the kids come together, holding their signs, speaking their truth, being seen. There was a write-up in I think the local Tribune, and I put it on our teachers' Facebook page. Lots of cute pictures if you want to check it out. I forget. I'll look it up and I'll put it in the chat.
Kari, the question of resources, the question of how do we do this comes up for a lot of people, right? People will say, well, yeah, I'd love to talk about George Floyd, but I'm a science teacher. I'd love to talk about state violence, but, I have to teach them about the Peloponnesian War. Whatever the thing might be, people say, how can we do the job of teaching, particularly at a moment where curriculums are so prefigured, where in some places, there's not even room for individual sort of reflection or critical engagement. We're kind of teaching to a test or teaching to a script. How can I deal with the problems of the outside world, number one? And number two, are there areas of the curriculum where it just doesn't fit? Like if I'm teaching times tables, how can I talk about Breonna Taylor?
Well, you have to, I think.
Okay, that's a good start.
I mean, I just don't see how those conversations can't be happening. And I mean, in a lot of mathematics classrooms, what people will do, what one of the teachers that I studied did was she took the lesson of that particular day, but she set it in a social justice context for her classroom. And so teachers right now, that's what they're doing. They're having these conversations around what is happening in the real world. What are your emotions around that? I think Sean Ginwright's work is really powerful around radical healing and racialized trauma. And the type of school, I wanted to mention this, the type of school experience that Muffy was mentioning about centering the child and then child gets to choose. There are white students who get to experience that all the time, right? Like Montessori, Reggio Emilia type of schools. they get to learn about their own history, right? I think that ethnic studies is something that should be in all schools. There are districts, and also the California State University system in California is getting pushed right now to, have ethnic studies for all students, because it's something that we don't get to learn about. Like, everything that I know about my own Japanese American history is like things that, you do on your own. Like, people, like Muffy was saying, like teaching your own students, like you should be getting paid for that work. Other people get paid for teaching, you should be getting paid for that labor. And I think also, I just wanted to touch on this notion of like, what are the white students learning? And that's something that became really interesting to me because, I organized this math and social justice conference. Well, now it's STEAM and social justice. And I've been doing that for the past 13 years. And I noticed that, we always had this group of like white teachers from these private schools, and it was completely funded. Their principal gave them release time. They paid for their flight. They paid for their hotel. And so I did study a teacher who was doing that type of work in her own classroom. The conversations were very different. It wasn't about what's going on in my community. It was what's going on in the neighbors' community. And how do I feel about that? And what can I do with my privilege in order to enact change? And I think now, as a teacher educator, and in Pennsylvania, we know is the whitest state for teachers. It's 96% white. I think it's really important because not only are our pre-service teachers going to be teaching students of color, but many of them are also going to be teaching white students, right, who need to believe in racial justice. And so I do think it's critically important for us to also be thinking about, what are folks of dominant backgrounds learning.
Absolutely. Someone else want to jump in on this point? Yes, please, Muffy.
So I also wanted to say that you can also look to the homeschooling community for that, because many Black homeschoolers have developed curriculums that center Indigenous, African American, just people who've gone through oppression. There are a few that I really like. There's the Woke Homeschooling, wokehomeschooling.com. She created a curriculum called O Freedom that focuses on Indigenous populations. There's the Kamali Academy curriculum, which teaches African math and also has a whole line of workbooks to help Black children to center themselves and understanding African American history in particular. There is a ton. I have them all listed on my website, brownmamas.com. You can go there and look in the homeschooling resources section. But there are resources out there. The problem is that we don't live in school districts that want to teach ethnic studies. And I think we have to really stop skirting around these issues and realize that our system does not want this to occur. They don't want Black children to learn Black history, because then that means that white people must learn Black history. So, we just got to be real about what's actually happening here. If we have majority white teachers, why would I raise up the people that I'm oppressing?
Word up. I think that one of the benefits of like this current climate that we're in is that we can start those schools in online schools. And I think that we can create online classrooms. I know through my work with the Propel Action team, a group of student leaders across a couple of the different high schools, we've been able to address and do some community service work. We've also continued to have discussions and dialogues about what's going on with the protests, about systemic racism. I feel like those are great opportunities for students, like the outside of class learning time, like creating, and kind of like, it's almost, I was kind of almost thinking about this during COVID. It was like, if students were doing something during the day, so if they didn't log into the school classroom, what other classrooms could have been offered where they could have sat with somebody and learned a dope skill, learn different topics? If they had more choice, right, they would probably attend things that were more aligned with their interests or that resonated with them. And I think that, as we move to online instruction, which is kind of like something you can see inevitably, we'll get there. Like, that's something for us to be thinking about.
Monica, I want to go to you. I want to talk about, we'll have plenty of time for other conversation too. But after that, I want to bring Derek in. But I'd like all of you to weigh in on this. But Monica, let me start with you. There's been so much conversation against the backdrop of all the madness going on that we have to reopen America, that we have to open up the economy, that we have to open up the country. There's been conversation that, at some point we're going to have to confront COVID and the issues as a nation by taking them head on. And this language has been used to justify, in many ways, ignoring some of the public health warnings, ignoring basic science, ignoring common sense, and sometimes ignoring the cries of parents and other, and students, the elderly. But one key place where this has happened is schools. We have a Secretary of Education who's saying, open them up, send your kids back. There are politicians in many states saying, we're going to open up our schools if we can. The president is saying, get back to school. Mm-hmm. What do you make of that? What are the consequences of this type of decision? What does it say that this is our commitment?
I mean, when you use that kind of language, right, and you say it so often and so loud, when you have a public platform, then you have people believing you that this is the way that we should do it, even though that science isn't behind it. And it just really makes you think about, if this is the route that they're saying that we should go, then why are we so expendable, right? Why are we, why, at the expense of who? At the expense of who is this going to come? Who is this going to benefit? It's going to affect those of us who can't afford, to have other resources or, to send them to schools that might have better resources. And even, I just think about the amount of children that go to school at our public schools. When we talk, I was just kind of going back to this defunding of the police, right? Everybody is up in arms about the defunding of the police, right? Where were all those people when they have been defunding the schools all of this time?
Right.
All of a sudden, everybody's mad. Well, I mean, I've been mad, right? And so, we need to start changing the narrative. We need to start changing the conversations and thinking about ways that are going to benefit us instead of benefiting the people in power. And that's what this really is, because they don't care about us, right? And if you think, I'm sorry, maybe I'm not answering the question, but I'm kind of going back to this.
No, you're getting somewhere important here, yeah.
Where it's instead of thinking about how to better equip the police, we need to start thinking about how to better prepare our children so that they have more opportunities in life. And this whole idea of putting police in schools, to our families, that leads to a deportation. Mm. So again, who is important? Who is expendable? Who do they really care about? And that's what the message that I'm getting, and that I continue to get every time I read the newspaper or I listen to the news, on a daily basis. And again, I don't know if I answered your question.
No. You absolutely. What do you all make it? What else do you all have to say about this? Amil, look, you about to jump in. What do you say?
I think that what we're gonna end up seeing is that school in America is gonna look very different depending on your zip code. If you're from a more affluent school district, it's gonna look one way, and I feel like it's gonna look different in the hood. It's different in Black and brown communities across America, urban America. So,
I also think that this is why I refuse to be pessimistic about this, because we are seeing parents for the first time exploring homeschooling, unschooling, self-directed learning. Educators, administrators of education right now need to take heed to that and need to understand what that means. That means that parents are ready to make an investment in their children's education. And many of them, for the first time, generations behind them have not ever done this. And so for that reason, we need to begin to galvanize and organize the collective power we have as parents and educators and begin to shift these systems. Because the reality is they're not going to shift on their own. They're not going to shift because of Title I. They're not going to shift because of some government mandate. They're going to shift because the people who are the stakeholders within the system decide to make a change. So we have to decide to make a change, and we have to get out of this ideology that this one box way of learning is the only way that works. We know that it does not work for our kids. Kids of color do not learn in these systems. They don't learn. And if we, I mean, at this point, it's like, I understand this is a job for you. I get it. Like, this is a job for you. You're a teacher, you're an administrator. If you cut this off, where are you going from here? But the answer is you're going somewhere because you have a skill set that is needed and necessary. Kids need to learn. They need to learn. They need to understand the world and the way it works around them. So it's not like you have a skill set that can only exist within this one box. You have a skill set that can exist wherever you decide it can exist at. And parents are willing to pay for it. They're willing to pay for it. They're willing to invest in you. But the problem is there's been divestment in so many aspects. There's been divestment by parents. There's been divestment by educators, and therefore students are not buying into it anymore. So we have to stop. Like, we have to decide to stop. And this is giving us the perfect opportunity to stop, rethink, decide again, and create a world where our kids can actually learn, because they're not learning in these systems. They're learning, as Carter G. Woodson put it, to be miseducated. If a child, you cannot say that an education is a good education if that same child cannot take that education back to their community and raise up their community. That's not a good education. That is rote memorization. That is the ability to replicate and regurgitate. That is not a good education. So we have to start calling a spade a spade. White kids are doing, if white kids are doing okay, because the evidence says white kids ain't even doing okay, then let them be. The ones who are doing okay, let them be. Let them stay in the system. The ones who ain't, which is the vast majority of Black, brown, and poor white kids, get them out of there, because we're wasting our time and our future in this system.
Anyone else want to jump in on this question of opening the schools back up in the fall?
I love what Muffy said. That's just what I want to say. She inspiring me over here. She got me got me going to abolitionist school network for real. Like,
oh,
you can do it. Parents want it. Like, parents reach out to me all the time. They're like, when are you going to start something? I'm actually getting ready to start my first homeschooling co-op. But the parents want it.
That's real, and we need more parent engagement. Like, you know what I'm saying? That's what. But like you're saying, it's a changing tide. There's more parents getting engaged. More parents is tired. I heard some parents talking like they're surprised they didn't know, like, to see their kids working on the schoolwork, what their deficits were, or like what they're not learning, what they are getting. So that's deep.
Let me bring Derek in. I know he's here with us right now, so that we can have, the next phase of our conversation, which is to bring in a wider range of questions. Derek, of course, jump in with your own questions, but also questions from the audience, questions from the participants who are watching with us are so key to what we do here. So Derek, you can take it from here.
Okay, I appreciate it. Wow, this has been such a rich conversation thus far. And one of the things I want to start with, we're getting a lot of good questions from our attendees and viewers. I want to start with this question, and anybody can think about this. One of the ways that systems survive is the mass production of the belief that this system is the system, the only system, the right system, and that in the absence of that system, there's chaos. And I think that's one of the spaces that we're in around school and schooling and teachers and teaching. And so we find ourselves really trying to combat the fear of students and parents who say, if I'm not in this system, will I be prepared for this future? If I'm not a part of this system that we've known for so long in this country, will I then be prepared to access all that is available to me beyond that? And so I think one of the things that COVID has done for us, as Harmony said, it shows the vulnerability of the system. It shows the fragility of the system. And it also shows that the system is not always applicable, particularly to those who are most in need. So I want to ask this question: how do you sustain, as we are thinking about reimagining? I think there's that initial reimagining of what schooling is, and then there's the imagining of what schooling might be. How do you sustain this idea around departing the system and what we might create in this space? How do you sustain that? Because that transition from leaning on a system for so long to imagining what might be is something that must be done with such care and concern for those who are about to make that journey. How do you sustain that journey?
As someone who sustained it, I would say you have to be willing to do the work. And it's hard. When we first started homeschooling our kids, it was the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. It caused mental distress, it caused financial distress. But I think what helped me to get through it was my village of people. So we have to develop the villages that are going to sustain us, and also recognize that it's okay to not be sure. Like, nothing ventured is nothing gained. So you have to go into it knowing that there is a certain amount of uncertainty because it's something new. You can't go in it expecting to lean on the same system that you're trying to remove yourself from. I think we have to and then also begin to demystify the idea that it ever worked in the first place. And I think the more you give people the remembrance that it didn't work in the first place, the stronger of a stake it gives them in trying to make what's new work. But I think, number one, we have to do this together. So it can't just be me out on an island. There has to be maybe 5 of us at a time. And then we also have to recognize that we have to continually demystify this past idea, this wrong idea that it ever worked in the first place.
Anyone else want to jump into that conversation? Please.
So I want to bring in, I'm sure folks are familiar with this Audre Lorde quote that, the master's tools will never break down the master's house. And I, like I was saying, Muffy, like, I feel like you should be compensated. It just makes me angry that folks have to do extra work, that the Karens and the Amy Coopers in our schools aren't doing that work, right? And so I think that there has to be some type of middle ground where folks aren't, doing homeschool. I mean, doing like 3 full-time jobs at home, right? You're raising your kids, you're homeschooling your kids, you have your own career, right? Whereas someone else is getting paid to not do anything. And so maybe that's, like opening your own schools. At one point in time, I actually have my principal's license. At one point in time, I wanted to open my own, social justice school. But I do think that that's a big, big question.
Yeah. So I'm thinking about, there are 2 sides of the coins. When I'm looking at the audience questions, there is the side that really is focused on reimagination and taking this moment to reimagine. And then there are those who may be teachers or maybe parents who are asking the question, if school remains the site, what does the site look like beyond COVID? And one of the things that I was able to capture through some of your conversations was this idea that what you're doing is novel. You're talking about social justice in your classroom. You're reimagining math as an African-centered science. You are seeing the curriculum in the ways that students actually live, and you're seeing the value and the brilliance of that, but you're doing so in your classroom, in your interaction with the students, and in very small and narrow spaces. How do you then turn that moment into something that is a larger and more systematized moment for your students? Because what you're doing is great in the corner, but how do we move that from the margin to central if school is to be the site of this activity?
I can speak on some current efforts. I mean, so the conference that was co-founded in 2007, brings together educators from across the country to think about that question, to share resources. We do have a very small resource bank, and the Google Doc that I put together has resources for folks who want to do this work in their classroom. There are 2 books that I have linked there. And actually, I know folks are working on 3 more books at the early elementary, and middle school levels. So those books I know are going to be coming out soon. And then I think it's teacher networks. So a lot of the work that Muffy does around like bringing networks of folks together. And so in that Google Doc, I also linked some grassroots teacher activist organizations that are doing this work in their classrooms. And I think that it's a lot of, trying it out, getting your students to co-facilitate with you, getting your students to help you with ideas. And if you can, in some ways, try to, I believe that students should be compensated for their labor, right? Because I don't think that we should be asking them to do work and not compensating them. But if there's some way to try to have some type of partnership, maybe it's like part of a school internship that they have at their school where they are advisors to teachers and they have a leadership role. But those are some of my thoughts on that question.
There's the Sudbury Model. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of that. The Sudbury Model is a curiosity-led first. There are Sudbury schools all over the United States, and they basically allow children a lot of the things that Kari was talking about. It's a democratically led school led by children. The children are not necessarily incentivized to learn, but they are incentivized in that they play a leadership role in the schools. So whereas, in regular schools, kids just do what adults tell them to do. In Sudbury schools, it's the opposite. And it's also, the kids don't necessarily have a traditional educational path as much as it is exposing them to SUDBURY, as much as it is exposing them to things that they may or may not be interested in. So I think that the Sudbury Model, as well as homeschooling co-ops, which there are lots, Pittsburgh just doesn't have one. Well, Pittsburgh has them, but they're all white. So the one that Brown Mamas is going to start is pretty much going to be the first Black one. But that's another model to use, is the homeschooling cooperative model, where basically it's parents as well as a lot of parents who many times are educators, teachers, reading specialists. They've worked in school districts, come together and provide formal instruction, but still curiosity-led instruction. Or it just depends on the homeschooling, the makeup of the homeschool, because homeschool makeups can be a mix of traditional homeschoolers, unschoolers, self-directed learners, deschoolers. It can be a bit of a hodgepodge, but it's just dependent upon, the adults as well as the children deciding upon what the model of the school wants to be. But I do want to point out that even as a homeschooling parent, I think that learning is best done in a cooperative environment. I'm not a fan of the current model of homeschooling because it is very Eurocentric. I'm in the house with my kids, reading them books, and it does not take into account the fact that we live in a community. And if we were in our indigenous state and our children were learning, they would be learning in a community. They'd be learning alongside adults. They'd be learning alongside other kids who are their age, and then some kids who aren't their age. So I think we really need to begin to reimagine, and us adults, whether we're parents, educators, administrators, but people who have stakes, we need to be the ones to lead the charge, because we're the ones that are going to give the parents and the kids the confidence to be able to operate in a new normal.
Well, I think what you mentioned here is moving from seeing those models as alternative models to really exceptional models. And I think that takes an entire shift of our thinking about what the system is. I'm thinking about a recent law that was passed at the California state system, where students at the collegiate level have to take either an ethnic studies course, or they have to take a social justice course. And this is at the collegiate level. Now at the K through 12 level, there is also a push for ethnic studies in the K through 12 as a requirement for graduation. So you're seeing more conversations about how to include and really center ethnicities, different cultural backgrounds into the K-12 space that we already know. But I frame that in the context of some of your earlier comments about being told not to discuss COVID, being told not to discuss the violence that's happening in the children's lives, not to discuss disparities, not to discuss those things that might anger or upset us. And as a teacher, how does one see and witness and then be held bound by either administration or the school environment to not speak about what you're seeing? And then if you don't speak about it, how can you then incorporate, how can you be agile? How can you really create a safe space for those children to feel free to talk about those things. So I really love to hear how teachers not only go against the grain and broach those subjects, but how do you then turn to your coaches and administrators to say, this is not only something that we should be doing, it's something that is necessary for teaching, necessary for learning, necessary for growth. How do we move that from, again, this special thing where you have these conversations, but you actually bring them into the curriculum, bring them into the learning space as valid points of conversation? Because there's learning to be had when you discuss Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, to COVID. There's learning to be had there, rather than seeing it, these are sites of just trauma and discord, but these are also sites of learning. How do you face your administration when you're trying to bring that to the classroom?
Can I change that question?
Sure.
I actually think that teachers should not have to do that.
Okay.
I think this should be more about what do school leaders need to do to support their students and their teachers. Teachers should not be thinking about that. I mean, I was very lucky. The school that I taught at, my principal, Luis Delgado, I used to take my students to protests and rallies in the middle of the school day. I had parents' consent. My students were the ones on the mic, right? And that was part of what we were doing as a learning community. And you know, my dean is Dr. Valerie Kinlock, who is amazing, who also supports, you know, the organizing work that I do at Pitt. And so I think that this should be more about what can leaders do to literally just get out of the way of the teachers and the students who are doing the work, and how can leaders support the work that students and teachers are already doing.
No, I appreciate that shift, thinking about what's the community responsibility, and because oftentimes the school culture is dictated by the administration, and so what one feels is permissible, it really is a reflection of what the leadership says is permissible, or what is allowable. And thinking about breaking down these barriers, we all mentioned cooperative learning. One of our our viewers asked this question about mutual aid. You know, this idea that in the case of an emergency, we are often seeing where resources get to move beyond borders. They're able to cross districts, cross zones, cross city boundaries. What would it look like if Fox Chapel were to share resources with some of the most needy schools in Pittsburgh Public? What would it look like for not just the public space, but for the Winchester Thurstons, the private schools, to share space and to share resources? Is this a moment for that? And let's talk about the readiness and willingness of schools to do this mutual aid. How do we make that a technology? You're on mute, Kari.
No, I love that idea, but I wanted someone else to share.
Oh, okay.
I would think that that's an interesting thought right there. I don't know if, you know, that's almost like, do we need charity, or do we need like donations from communities that have ignored us? You know, there may be some benefit like materially, but I don't necessarily know. I think it depends on the intentions. Like, I work in Pittsburgh and work with a lot of youth organizations. I would love to see more interaction between communities of students that are segregated, because Pittsburgh has a tremendous amount of segregation. I would love for our students to experience, like, see what other schools have, and to see what, and for other students to meet them too. Like, they shouldn't have to go to college to have to have some level of integration. So I think that these are already like exchanges that should have been taking place. I think that if they have the right intentions, it shouldn't be like, oh, let's go help poor school districts. But it should be like, yo, we're lacking our own humanity, because there's been a crisis going on in Black America before the COVID, and we're late to the party, and we have a lot to learn. That would be a good attitude.
Right, and I think thinking about it in ways, you know, heretofore it was called charity, and it's, you know, giving to those most in need. But there is a cross need around cultural cross-pollination we need to see this as social justice. We live in a capitalist society where resources are hoarded. Pittsburgh is really emblematic of what's happening across the country. Schools are not only segregated by race, they're segregated by class, they're segregated by ethnicity, and we have demonstrated that your tax dollars and the amount of property that you own and the value of that property should then dictate the quality of the education that you have. And so I'm not certain that in 100 years, if we look back, or if people look back at our time here to say that when you have money, you should have more resources, I'm not certain that that's something that we want to leave as a legacy. And as we tear down monuments, as we tear down statues, we got to think about tearing down those kinds of things as well. I want to ask you all about priorities. And we're finding that some of our viewers are asking about the arts and how in a time of crisis, things like the arts and music and those things that are considered extra parts of the curriculum, they are also pushed even farther into the margins. And what's your take on centralizing those, particularly as we think about art as healing, art as cultural exchanges, and art as just part of the standard curriculum? And I guess I'm thinking about Amil with your focus on hip hop, but anybody feel free to jump in to that.
Could you restate that question, please?
So thinking, we have some viewers who ask, as African-American artists, they feel that they are even more marginalized in this space of COVID, seeing that their art is not valued. It's not something that we should focus on in the middle of a pandemic. And they feel even further pushed outside of the core of what should be in curriculum space.
They definitely, I mean, we need more artists, you know what I mean? We should support our artists, and we should also get some like tech artists, you know, get some artists that use different forms of technology, get artists access to technology so they can teach better lessons using, you know, like remote learning and stuff like that. I mean, art is important, like how you process your emotions, how you express yourself, like that's critical. I mean, like now this is a moment, like this is where I feel like students benefit from having direct instruction, but I've been telling students that I interact with, like now is a powerful time. Like the value of a photograph has changed. You know, 4 or 5 months ago, you take a picture, it doesn't mean nothing. Now there's so much more, or I don't want to say it doesn't mean anything. Now there's so much more historical significance to that picture because you're capturing a historical moment. So I don't know, it's just really like teaching people like, hey, appreciate the simple things of art. Maybe delve into photography, gardening. I think schools should support that. I mean, that's healthy, holistic education. But you know, fun, like you said, it comes down to funding and putting the, you know, they got like so much curriculum to cover, and you know, art sometimes is always like pushed to the back burner. But I think with art and technology at the same time, you can kind of push that.
I appreciate that. So we've got lots of questions on reimagination and reimagining schools. There are lots of people who are discussing the fact that, or the demonstrated data that show that schools tend to reproduce our current social system. Even if there's an uptick for all groups, the gaps still remain. And so if you are sitting in front of school board members, teachers, and other decision makers, if the system still exists as we have it today, the question goes to Harmony from our audience, and it goes to Muffy. But I'm asking beyond you two panelists, please, for everybody else to jump in. What do you say about redesigning schools? Muffy, the question comes to you is, if you had to take from your homeschool experience and sprinkle some of that into, not say sprinkle, but to spread that into the current K-12 system, what are some of the core values that you take from homeschool into the K-12 environment to better that environment? And Harmony, the question to you is, if you could reimagine and redesign schooling, what would you say as as a recent graduate would be some of your priorities there? And we can start with you, Harmony, I saw your hand raised.
I was fixing my hat, but yeah, I'll answer first. Yeah, I guess, I don't know. That's such a hard question to answer in the short time that we have. I guess I would just say one thing because it was just on my mind because it was the last question. In terms of like extracurricular activities, I definitely think that for a lot of students in general, but especially for a lot of Black students, because I feel like, sorry, I figured that. I feel like for Black youth, like music and arts is very essential to our being and how we create and how we communicate with each other. So I definitely think that in predominantly Black schools, seeing that highlighted and also seeing how youth can turn that into a business. I know of a lot of my friends who only went to school when they had extracurricular activities, and then they would just leave and go home afterwards or something like that. And instead of, obviously we want to learn math and reading too, but instead of shunning them for that and saying, no, you have to do this, instead realize that that's something that they're clearly passionate about and show them, hey, here's what you can do with this, or hey, this is something that you can make into a career. For me, I think that I see a lot of that after we graduated and my friends. Like a lot of my friends started their business after they graduated. And for me, to so graciously plug, me starting my own cosmetic company recently, I'm realizing how helpful it would have been to have teachers and staff in my school to be like, hey, this is something that you can use with your talent. I see that you're passionate about this and you're clearly not so passionate about this. So let me hone in on what you're passionate about and teach you how to start your business, as opposed to me kind of now at a point where I kind of have to do it on my own, more or less, which is okay. And I think I'm doing okay so far, but it definitely would have been nice to have that help initially, as opposed to just trying to do it on my own.
Yeah, that's the curiosity-driven curriculum. And that's
sorry for the thunder, by the way. I'm fine, but it's kind of loud.
You made the thunder.
Responsive. And that's culture responsive teaching and learning. When you demonstrate a curiosity and then the school rises, and I use rises intentionally to meet that curiosity. So I want to move to you, Muffy. What do you bring from your expertise into the K-12 environment?
I would just start with the quote from Amos Wilson that says, educating Black children is not enough. It must be education that is relevant to solving the problems of African people. If it's not relevant to solving our problems, then why are we teaching it? And I say that to say that art is the genius of African people. Art, music, emotion, being able to stir emotion with our bodies, with what we make, with what we create, that is the magic of Black people. And if we are suppressing that, then we are not bringing our best to the world stage. Look at the way rap music has transformed the world. Look at the way we've transformed the world with our different forms of dance and movement and singing and all those things. And when we're suppressing that in our children, we're not bringing our genius to the world. And not that we don't have other forms of genius, but that is by far where we lead. We lead in the way we can move our bodies. So why are we not giving our children as much time as possible to focus on those things, whether it be drawing, whether it be playing a piano, whether it be public speaking? We can move people with our physical being. So we need to begin to do that. All of my kids are talented and gifted in one of those ways, and we give them maximum time to focus on that. So I would echo what Harmony said. If I could, bring something from my homeschool, it would be allowing my kids more time to focus on what they want to focus on, because we're not centering kids. And that's why this is why school doesn't work, because it's not centered around the people it's supposed to work for. It's centered around adults who don't have a stake any longer in the claim. Our stake is that we get paid to do the job, and that we hopefully, the ones of us who are good, we want to see the future be well. But that still is not enough. It's no different than the difference between the CEO of a company and the owner of a company. The owner, this is their lifeblood. The CEO works here. So we need to start focusing on the owners. The owners are Harmony. The owners are Amil. They are the young people who are closest to these experiences. They're the young people who are going to benefit the most from these experiences. So why are we the leaders? It doesn't make any sense. And so that's how our homeschool operates. Our homeschool operates kid first. So we do that by asking our kids questions instead of telling them what they're going to do. Now, sometimes we tell them what to do because they get on our nerves. And in those instances, you're going to be told because you ain't going to keep getting on my nerves. But when it really comes down to it, we ask them questions about what they want to do, about how we can support them, about what they want to explore. And we try to lead from that space. And it's hard, y'all. That's what I will say. First and foremost, it is hard because I'm an adult and I'm used to being in control and I don't want no kid telling me what to do. But at the end of the day, you have to look at it in terms of this ain't about you. This is about the kids and allowing the kids to create a reality with which they can live in which they are capable of solving the problems of. Because if we're creating realities that our kids are not, and we're creating these problematic realities every day. Look at what we've done in the last 60 days. It hasn't been very great. And we're not raising up children who are capable of solving the problems because, like Janet said, 7-year-olds aren't even talking about it.
And sometimes they're not allowed to talk about it. And I think, to your point, as we get ready to close here, I think about the fact that we have teachers, students, and teacher educators here. It appears to me that the owners that you referenced, Muffy, never get to meet those who are in teacher educator programs. Those who are in teacher educator programs, they meet the streets sometimes in their student teaching. And then when they meet them, Black and brown folks and poor folks and marginalized folks are pathologized. And so they've read about you, they've heard about you, they haven't engaged you. And so when they do meet you, there's a reticence to engage. There is all this anxiety that's been built up because of the disconnect. And because we remain so disconnected, we tend to have wonderful programs at Research One institutions, still training teachers to maintain that divide. Whether they do it actively or passively, it's still doing the same thing. So we have to really not just reimagining what happens at the K-12, but who's entering our teacher education programs and what experience that they have. And then what experience then leads them to be equipped and capable and willing and ready and humble enough to enter the community space, not just as a teacher, but also as a learner. And so I'm going to ask Dr. Hill to come back. I so appreciate all of you for being here. I appreciate all of our panelists and all of our viewers for sticking with us. It's been a wonderful session. I'm looking forward to next week. So thank you, Dr. Hill.
Yes, it's been a wonderful conversation, a great set of ideas, really pushing the boundaries of what we know and what we'd like to know. The conversation about what it means to teach and to be an educator in this space has been challenged by this conversation. Thinking about our individual circumstances, but also the structural demands and the structural circumstances that push us to where we are has been very helpful to me. And I'm learning so much as we go week to week, and this week has certainly been no exception. One of the things that's come up this week has been the number of resources, the books, the links, the articles. And so we'll be very careful about making sure that people have access to those resources so that we can continue the conversation in all sorts of new ways. I want to thank all of you for coming and spending the last couple of hours with us. Harmony, Muffy, Kari, Amil, thank you so much. Janet, Monica, thank you so much for being part of the conversation. Again, you've challenged us to think about these things differently. One of the questions I asked you about was what the fall would look like and whether school should open or not. And as in characteristic, brilliant fashion, you all challenged me to not just answer that question with a yes or a no, but to think about what kind of schools we'd open up to, what kind of world we'll be in, and what those worlds can and should look like, whether or not we have an open school in September or not. Thank you for challenging us. Thank you for challenging our ideas, and thank you all for watching it. Again, this conversation about crisis and crisis pedagogies is one that we need to continue to have, not just in Pittsburgh and not just in this virtual space, but around the country and indeed around the world. We are in a moment of crisis, but as always, the people can and will prevail. Ultimately, we will be victorious, and the work that we do every week here helps us get there. Next week, we'll be having the final of our 5 sessions. I'll be talking to school leaders and experts on school leadership to think about what it means to, again, to engage in leadership in a moment of crisis. Until then, thank you all. Be safe, and please wear a mask. See y'all next week.